that point though, I'd like to hand over to Malcolm. So Malcolm, we're delighted to have you. Thank you very much for joining us today.
So thank you everyone, and thank you, David, for organizing this this opportunity for me to present a bit of my work to I would not say the Anglophone world, but people that are used to working in a more Anglophone world than I am. And so I see there are people from Wales, but also from the States, and I'll be very interested in some of your comments and questions at the end of the presentation. So I'll try to say a few words about my work and about the book, and hoping to, let me just put my watch so that I don't go over time. Yeah, to speak for about 40-45 minutes and maybe even less, and then have the rest of the time for discussion and to engage in the fruitful exchange. So yeah, I've prepared a slide. Oops, I need to share it. Here it is. And the title of the presentation takes the title of the book, really, that I've published in French 2 years ago, and that just came out in English. That's the way it looks in English. Yeah, Decolonial Ecology, Thinking from the Caribbean World, and I'll try to say a bit more about the path that I took and how I came to suggest or write a book that, as David highlighted, tried to bring together two different body of works that are usually thought as separate. Yeah. A bit about me, of course. I think it's very important to acknowledge where we speak from. And I was born and raised in Martinique. I don't know if David said that before, but and I spent the first 18 years of my life there. So Martinique is a francophone, non-sovereign overseas department of France, basically a former colony of France. And there are many remaining colonies of overseas departments of France in three oceans, the Caribbean, the Atlantic, the Indian Oceans, and Pacific. And I always like to start with this reminding of the position where I speak from, which is a marginalized position within the French Republic, but also geographically located in the tropics, where we are subjected, as this satellite image showed, to different types of environmental challenges and climatic events. And this was in 2017, I think, when we had 3 major hurricanes at almost the same time on this region. And I was in Martinique at the same time there. So a bit of background. Martinique was colonized in 1635 by the French, remained French up till today. However, in 1946, that's when we had the what we called the law of departmentalization, which basically means a sort of statutory decolonization. So we were no longer considered as colonies, but we would have equal rights, the same as the quote unquote mainland France. And I think in Britain you do have some similar islands in the Caribbean as well that follow similar paths. To give, I put these slides here to acknowledge also the political context in which my book, the French one, was published, and which may differ from the British, the Welsh, or even the United States context. In France, we are at a moment where scholars, academic people that engage with decolonial, post-colonial theories are being politically attacked or shamed, or trying to be shamed in the public. We had Ministry of Higher Education and of Secondary Education requesting my research institute to do a survey on us. And these are some of the op-eds in major journals like Le Monde, Le Figaro, which is not very, but French journals that usually says, be careful. People that are engaging in decolonial thoughts, intersectional studies, gender studies, are actually a threat to the French Republic. But at the same time, on the other side, you do have a kind of appropriation of the term decolonial ecology by some environmental organizations and some groups. So I've given you some images of what has happened since my book came out. So this on the top and left, this is a demonstration that took place in the center of Paris by the climate youth movement that had this big flag saying towards or in favor of a decolonial ecology in French. The 15th of May of this year, you had also different demonstrations that again use this term in the streets. Other journals that engage with that, like the Funambulist, and a documentary in which I took part, as well as being one of the people that are interviewed, called in French Decolonial Ecology, but in English would be Decolonizing Ecology. What is special about these is that they take place within the French context, because some of the issues that I'm tackling with have been tackled with for a long time, especially by Native Americans and the environmental justice movements in the States and somewhat in Britain as well. But in France, it was not the case. Okay. Now, this is just to give you a bit of context. Now, in the presentation today, I don't think I'll go through all the 4 parts here, but I'll just highlight some of the 2 main questions that I've kind of guided my work and are guiding my work at the moment. Then I'll come back to the double fracture of modernity that David mentioned and when he introduced me, what I call the colonial and environmental fracture of modernity. And we'll see if we have time for the 3rd part and the 4th part. Okay. So let's go. So the 2 questions that I'm grappling with, one can be symbolized by the story of Vanessa Nakate, who is a young woman activist from Uganda who founded 2 NGOs, and I think she made the news globally last year at the Davos meeting, World Economic Forum in Davos, because of this picture. Maybe some of you already remember, but she was part of a 5-woman group that came to call on the world economic actors on the dangers of global warming. And then there was a picture taken after the conference, and she was cropped out of the picture. Indeed, the real picture was this one. And now, and we are in February 2020. Now, what was very interesting about this event is Vanessa Nakate took to Twitter or Instagram and denounced the fact that she was cropped out of the picture. And then the Associated Press defended the choice, saying, well, there was nothing racist or biased or even about this choice. It was just a question of, and I quote, composition, a question of composition, in the sense that 4 white women behind the snow-capped Swiss mountain were more palatable to the public than this Black person in front of some buildings. And this little story, to me, is indicative of a larger and longer history of exclusion within environmentalist groups and within the idea of what one understands to be a ecological issue or ecological image. And so that's questions of of the exclusions, of why some voices have been silenced and are still continuing to be silenced, is one that I've been grappling with. That was the first question. The second question, when I started my my dissertation. So one thing I haven't said is that this book is a result of a part of my PhD dissertation. My PhD dissertation that I conducted in Paris, at the Université Paris Diderot. And when I wanted to do this work, I was already interested in environmental issues, in environmental thoughts. I did the dissertation in political philosophy, and I wanted to understand, let's say, what it would mean to think of the ecological crisis from what I've termed the Caribbean world. And at the time, this was not a very easy question to defend, because I was told that, well, it doesn't matter where you're from, it doesn't matter where you are based, ecological issues are supposed to be universal, and there is no reason to really locate and situate the point from which you are speaking. But in my mind, even though I wasn't able at the time to verbalize and express it, I already had in mind, I already had an intuition that part of the story of the Earth, mainly the story of colonization and slavery, was being left out of the classical environmental narratives. As if, and as what I've come to argue and realize, as if one would not need to engage with the colonial and slavery history of modernity, the colonial and slavery history of the Earth, to deal with the ecological state of the planet. That is, for me, the fallacy that I'm trying to denounce and point in my book. Now, the reason why I chose the Caribbean world is twofold. Of course, there is this, let's say, evident and easy way of the fact that I grew up in that region. And this is a region that I know more than any other. But it's also part of, the reason is also the fact that the Caribbean has a very interesting position in both the globalization process and the way we understand modernity. Indeed, 1492 is when the so-called old world met the so-called new world. And I don't think these categories are very, very valid. But it's a place where the stories and cosmogonies of the native people from Americas, the bodies of Africas, and the sails of Europe were tied in one particular place. And this is a place where I wanted to propose a discourse, an ecological discourse from. Now, there is also a third reason why I chose the Caribbean, and that this time has more to do with the story of slavery itself, of transatlantic slavery. When, for example, people like Bruno Latour in his book "We Have Never Been Modern," there is, let's say, a binary understanding of modernity. You have the modern and the non-modern, the European colonists and the indigenous people on the one side, this dualistic understanding of modernity. But I believe that the Caribbean, because of the history of slavery, also bring to the debate a third term, and the third terms of modernity being that of the enslaved Africans transshipped via the slave trade to the Americas. Indeed, the story of the Caribbean is in part the story of these third terms that have rarely been heard within environmental circles. And so when I started my dissertation, 12 years, 13 years ago, and I was trying to develop, to pursue an ecological discourse from the Caribbean, I did not find at the time a philosophical proposition from one of these figures. So let's say I did not find the equivalent of a Aldo Leopold or a Henry David Thoreau or a Jean-Jacques Rousseau from the Caribbean. I mean that had verbalized and expressed an ecological discourse in such a way. So what I did is I tried to look at both the history, the artistic practices, the literature, and of course the contemporary ecological movements. And I tried to decipher in all of these different instances what type of relations, what type of environmental discourse would be suggested from this post-colonial and post-slavery situations. And this is how I came up and suggested this decolonial ecology. Yeah, I may go a bit fast, and if there are some questions, just keep them for the end, and I can come back a bit later to that. Now, in this part of the presentation, I want to come back to let's say a starting point that I've encountered when I conducted my research. What I've called the double fracture of modernity. Here you have two pictures of, let's say, two illustrations of the world facing ecological issues or facing the climate crisis. On the left, this is a flyer of one geographic conference that took place last year, a conference in which I was invited. And what's particular about this flyer, and that was in 2020, is that the city, Saint-Dié-des-Vosges, decided to illustrate the situation of the world facing the climate change with the image of one single man, one single bear, white bear, on an iceberg. And that was the idea, the image we have of, they were suggesting about what it means to be facing climate change. On the right, you have a painting, I think, of Peter Bruegel, of a Noah's Ark. Now, I will come back to why I focus so much on Noah's Ark later, but there is this metaphor that has come up in many environmental philosophers, from Michel Serres in France, Bruno Latour, James Lovelock, and many others, from even this idea of a spaceship Earth that was echoed back in 1970s. The figure of Noah's Ark has been used politically many times to illustrate the way the world is facing these different ecological challenges. Okay, now, what do I mean by the double fracture of modernity? What I mean by that is that there are two different fractures of modernity that have been thought as separate. Let's go with the first one first. So the table is in French, but I think you can follow. So this is, on the one hand, what I call the fundamental fracture, where you have on the top, the planet, nature, or the environment, these terms that are usually put forth, and on the bottom you have human, or the anthropos, the root of Anthropocene. Now, one way in which the ecological crisis has been understood, or the way we should act about it, has been precisely to reverse the modern hierarchy that put men and humans up on top of, in terms of value, on top of the planet and or the planet, nature, or the environment. So the environmentalist task was precisely the one that consists of reversing that hierarchy. One of the issues with such very simplistic understanding of the ecological crisis is that it homogenizes on both hands, regarding both the natural world and the human societies, situations that are in fact much more complex. If you go on the horizontal axis, most of the time, and that was the case in the 19th century, the nature that was meant to be preserved was related to this idea of virgin nature, wilderness, forest, parks, and so on and so forth. And very rarely, these included urban spaces, plantations, slums, and over more inhabited spaces. Of course, when people say, well, let's save the planet, protect the environment, there is even another fracture within this environmental fracture regarding the animals. And as the picture I've showed, even when the animal cause is being talked about, most of the time you would have these noble animals: the white bear, the wolves, the eagles, the tigers, the bear, the elephants, the whales, which are of course very important elements of the Earth's ecosystem. However, what constitutes today the vast majority of the weight of animals on Earth, like the cattle, the cows, the pigs, the lamb, the salmons, are semi talked about. So there is what I call the homogenization horizontally that simplify and oversimplifies the issue. And the same is true from the term human. Most of the time, the human that speaks, especially in environmental philosophy, is a white man, well-educated, of middle class at least, most of the time Christian. And the complexity, the plurality of humans on Earth is being washed. So in many, especially in France, in many, let's say, anthology of environmental thoughts, the first two names that are talked about as are Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Henry David Thoreau. And these are the terms with which the environmental fracture is talked about. Now, this homogenization and this hierarchy has been challenged by many movements, including political ecology, including ecofeminism, and social ecology. And however, in my work, I believe that even these movements that are more leftist and are trying to bring together the preservation of the natural environment with issues of equality, of justice, apart from the environmental justice movement, something is missing, something is left out, and that is the colonial fracture. Now, let me just go this time to the second fracture that I talked about. Yeah, this echoes what I was moving. So a different pillar of modernity has been the colonial fracture. The fact that the country, the very countries we have today, for example, in Africa or in Americas, were founded upon this colonial division of the earth. And like the environmental fracture, there has been many groups, movements, and thoughts that have tried to reverse this hierarchy, the hierarchy that put the colonized under the colonizer, and so on and so forth. And like the environmental fracture, there has been this homogenization that has tended to oversimplify the issue. Most of the time, the anti-colonial struggles were also being being made with a male gaze, and the issue of equality between different religions and between women and men were not necessarily talked about. And even though you have movements like, beside the anti-colonial struggles of the aftermath of the Second World War, even the subaltern movements and the Afrofeminist movement today that challenges this male gaze, one can say that a lot of people that have tackled this colonial fracture maybe have minimized the environmental or ecological issues of the world. And if you're wondering who am I speaking of, I'm thinking of people like Dipesh Chakrabarti, even Suleiman Bashir Jain, and so on and so forth. But what I term the double colonial and environmental fracture is precisely this divide that I've shown here on screen. On the left, you have groups, movements, courses, currents of thought that are really trying to figure out how do we deal with these changing conditions of life of the planet. And in doing so, somewhat, they do not really engage with the colonial foundations of modernity. On the right, you have the inverse, people that have really tried to think of what it means to live in a world where people like myself are being constantly marginalized, where our voices are not heard, where if, like in France, we are talking about anti-racist policies, we are being called a threat and so on and so forth. And yet, very rarely, seldomly engage with also the environmental destruction of the earth. Now, this is the divide, this is the double fracture. And this is the start of my book. And most of my work in this book is trying to go beyond that fracture, trying to provide an understanding of the crisis, understanding of the earth and the world, which really brings together these two perspectives. If you want some examples of where this fracture is being seen or is being felt, let me give you some. On the left, you have some major figures of the start of the diverse and various people of the ecological, movements and of environmental philosophy or environmental thought. People like John Muir, who founded some of the first national parks in the United States. Aldo Leopold, of course, Henry David Thoreau, and Arnes. But what is interesting is the kind of the absence of connections with some of the movements that were taking place at the same time. If we take, for example, Rachel Carson, Silent Spring, her book in 1962 is really a foundational moment for the environmental movements, criticizing DDT, criticizing the use of pesticides. A Silent Spring, there's no more birds singing because this DDT kills life. And at the same time, in 1960s in the States, you did have a civil rights movement with people like Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Black Panthers, and so on and so forth. However, very little connections were made, at least not until the later environmental justice movement in the 1970s and early 1980s. And the same thing could be said earlier about the need to preserve the environment and natural parks while not really engaging with the states and the questions, the demand of justice and reparation by the Native American people in the States. Now, I know there are some people in the States here, so maybe they'll say more than I can tell from afar. But the same fracture is being seen also in the French, in the former French Empire and the French Republic. Pierre Poivre, who was in the late 18th century one of the governor of the Isle of France, now known as Mauritius, he's being credited for being one of the first to put in place policies of forest preservation with the idea of limiting local climate change. There is a major book by Richard Grove, and two major books, but that you can see and that talks about it. And there is even the legend that he was very kind to the slaves. This of course is not true. But while this person is being celebrated for implementing these environmentalist policies, the fact that he was the governor of a colony, of a slave-making colony, the fact that he himself owned 88 enslaved people is pushed to the side, as if it did not matter. And this is and at the same time, what I show also in my book is that there were people that were enslaved and chained that already also had a philosophy of what it meant to live on Earth, and a practice that could be, even though it is anachronic, thought of as ecological. And one of the examples is the story of marronage. Marronage being this time understood not only as a political and social struggle for emancipation, the fact that you want to recover your own body from the slavery system, but also as an opposition to a plantation system, an opposition to what I call the colonial inhabitation, the practice with which you will try to live differently than the plantation system within the confine of the elements you find. So I hope most of people know what I'm talking about when I refer to marronage, but if not, it's the practice by which enslaved would flee the plantation and try to live in secluded places like hills, mountains, sometimes mangroves as well. And here you have a picture of the so-called unknown maroons in Haiti, in Port-au-Prince, and a major figure of marronage in Guadeloupe called Solitude. But the same can be said of the early 20th century and mid 20th century environmental philosophers in France. You have André Gorz, a major figure of political ecology, Charbonneau, Gunther Anders even, who was the first husband of Hannah Arendt, and Jacques Ellul. All of these people have really provided a very interesting criticism of technology and techniques, and the criticism of technology and techniques was a very important part of the development of the ecological movements in France. However, in doing so, most of the time, the colonial condition for the production of techniques and technology was overlooked. Let me give you an example. The Hiroshima bomb that exploded, the nuclear bomb that exploded in Hiroshima, the uranium came from the Belgian Congo. That means that it was the colonial exploitation of these lands that made it possible to create some of the technological problems that they were criticizing. And this is the case with the Aboriginal in Australia, with the Navajo people in the States. And yet, what is stunning is that in the criticism of technology, most of its authors failed to take into account this coloniality of technology. And in failing to do so, they failed to encounter and develop alliances with the anti-colonial thinkers that also had an anti-technological thought. People like Frantz Fanon Aimé Césaire, Kwame Nkrumah, the first president of Ghana, who mounted an expedition against the nuclear testing of France in the south of Algeria in the 1960s. And this is a slide I show usually to French people about this guy called Oscar Timarou, who is the former president of the French Polynesia, who is taking France to court for crimes against humanity because France, from 1960 so to 1996, bombed their country to did the nuclear testing. And of course, this was a colonial imposition and no justice has been done to this point. And even the victims of his nuclear testing have a hard time finding justice. And this is the double divide. Yeah. Finally, as I said, when we speak of France, this is the geographical image of what France is. You have this kind of hexagonal shape, and you have this and Corsica, and that's it. But as I mentioned in the start of this presentation, France is also made of these so quote-unquote overseas territories. And what is more surprising, and this is why this double fracture still carries on today, is the fact that these territories, like one where I'm from, Martinique, are the territories that hold most of the French national biodiversity. 80% of French biodiversity is located on these places, especially in Guyana, in French Guyana. 97% of the waters, of the French waters, is because of these places. Now, France now is the second maritime power in the world behind the States, and that is because of these islands. But if, let's say, French Polynesia, which is a country that is inscribed in the list of countries to be decolonized at the UN, you have this, the Committee of the 24. If, let's say, Polynesia was to become independent, then France will move from the second rank to the 14th rank. So, and these places account for about 2.7 million people to the 65 million of France. And in the discourse, in the political discourse, in the media, as well as in the philosophical courses, they are not talked about. We are not talked about. So this is very inconsequential. Now, yeah, this is a picture of some of the testing they did in Mururoa in Polynesia, 1971. They had both overground testing and and underground testing. I will move for that because it's. But I'll come back to this notion of, I mean, not come back to this notion of Anthropocene. What is the consequence of this divide? What is the consequence of this divide, of this fracture? In the way we think about the planet. So the term that has now been in vogue for the last 10 years is the term Anthropocene. Anthropocene was suggested by Paul Crutzen, but defended by many of us, in the aim of defining this new geological or geohistorical era that human beings would be in. However, I believe that because of this divide, because the colonial foundations of modernity have mainly been overlooked, that there is a kind of environmentalist grammar that is reproduced, and that would reproduce some of the inequalities, discrimination, and relation of power that already existed during the colonial era. So, and even in the grammar, I just took this sentence from one of the founding paper of Crotzel, McNeil, and Will Stephen. Humans' activities have become so pervasive and profound that they rival the great forces of nature and are pushing the Earth into planetary terra incognita. Now, if you pay attention to the language, which is a way in which we can analyze this paper, humans are believed to be on a ship, and that ship is going towards what they call the terra incognita. Now, this is the way in 2007 they described the situation of the humans on Earth. And of course, colonized people that have been colonized and formerly colonized, indigenous people recognize this grammar. And this is a colonial grammar. The belief that you are going into terra incognita is exactly the way the Australia and even Antarctica was perceived in the 18th and 19th century. And you can find Aboriginal artists that are deconstructing this grammar and this narrative. An artist like Gordon Bennett, who painted this picture in 1992, calling the myth of the Western man. And this is to me one of the dangers that I want to point out in the fact that when we overlook this colonial fracture, is the tendency that ecological learners, ecological circles, and even the grammar and the concept that we produce may be a reenactment of a white man's burden. A white man's burden, this time empowered by advances in scientific knowledge and scientific measurements of the different geological strata and so on and so forth. Yeah. So, yeah. I will move now directly to the fourth part, which is the way I try to go beyond what I call this colonial Anthropocene, or beyond this biased understanding of ecological issues. So I have decided to go with a very, let's say, storytelling presentation, but we can come back to more precise questions later on. But to start with, I want to come back to this painting. This painting, which is the cover of my book, and it's not just a painting to make it look beautiful, although this painting is beautiful, but at the same time extremely not so easy to look at. And it's a painting by William Turner, 1840, that is mostly known as a slave ship. Surprisingly, this is the only painting so far that we know of that Turner has dedicated to the story of the slave ship. And not just any story, it's a story of a slave ship called the Zong, which in 1781 left Liverpool, went to Ghana, or the Gold Coast at the time, traded for 440 human beings, and then went to Jamaica. However, in doing so, this ship made a navigational error, overshooting Jamaica, and realizing that they didn't have enough water for everyone, they made this crazy and harrowing decision, horrible decision, to throw overboard about 150 human beings, throwing them overboard to be drowned, to be eaten by the sharks that were usually following the slave ships. And one may wonder, why would they do so if the goal of the slave trade is to sell human beings? Well, they did so because they had an insurance. And to mount an expedition, a slave trade expedition, you would usually take insurances. And these insurances would foresee that if you had what they call perils of sea, hurricanes, cyclones, or even a mutiny, that the crew could claim back some of the money lost. but that insurance did not include navigational errors. So the crew decided that it was more profitable to throw overboard these people, pretending that there was some sort of, unforeseen circumstances, like a hurricane, instead of trying to ration the water and bring everyone safely to port. And one might say, well, okay, this is a very sad story, but this is the late 18th century. What does that have to do with today? Why should we talk about this today? Well, there are many ways to answer that question, but one is, let's say, one is metaphorical. One is questioning. One is, let's say, the question that these stories allows to ask today. Could it be that the ecological crisis, or even what we can say the climate tempest, can become an excuse not to live with those that are not wanted anymore? In a sense that the ecological crisis can become a way to get rid of people who do not share the same skin color, the same gods, the same sex, the same geographical origins. And this has been one answer of the eco-fascists and really troubling environmental philosophers as well. And but there are also many other more reasons why these questions matter. And when we think of one of the move I do in my book is also to think of a slave ship not just as a historical ship from the mid 16th century to the mid or late 19th century, but really as the French word is dispositif, but I don't know the English word, but let's say a socio-political configuration. That means a way of relating to other human beings, but also to the earth. In the sense that the slave ship also tells a story of the earth, a story that is untold in the classical Anthropocene environmentalist narratives. And in doing so, when we see the ongoing drowning of people in the Mediterranean Sea, when we see the 27 quote unquote migrants that passed away in the English Channel at the end of November, and which one can wonder whether the type of socio-political configurations that were already in place during the slave ship, whether they are still in place today, under different forms. Yeah, I'll move forward. Maybe on the question of colonial inhabitation, I will come back later, and I want to go rather quickly to other main ideas that I try to do in my book. And in terms of position, the way I challenge some figures like Henry David Thoreau or Jean-Jacques Rousseau is by doing this epistemic shift. That means this displacement in the way knowledge is being produced, in a displacement in the way one is apprehending the planet, the earth, the world. On the left, you have a picture of the former cabin of Henry David Thoreau on Walden Pond. Beautiful place, wonderful, especially during the summertime. On the right, you have pictures of the hold of a slave ship. And what's interesting is that at the very same time that Jean-Jacques Rousseau in Switzerland or in France was walking around the forest, writing his Lonely Walker dreaming. I don't know the English word, but the English title, but in French is Les Rêveries du Promeneur Solitaire. At the very same time that Henry David Thoreau was writing Walden, there were men, women, and children that were shackled in the holds of slave ships. And my intuition that they also had a sense of place, they also had an idea of what it means to live, to inhabit the earth, to make world. And the choice I make in this book is to shift the position from which these are this understanding of the earth and the world is being made. And the result of that is, in my opinion, in my view, a more political, incisive understanding of the ecological crisis. One where it is no longer possible to put aside the social, political condition, the domination, the subjugation, as well as the aspiration for emancipation, for equality, for justice, for dignity. It is no longer to put this aside and focus solely on sea level rise, on climate mitigation, on pollution reduction, but wanted to really bring them together. This is what I call a decolonial ecology. One at the time here from the Caribbean world. I'm going over time, but so I'll stop in just 2 to 3 minutes. But a final note, what I mean by decolonial ecology, I don't have this universal theory that will encompass the whole of the earth and the whole of the world. Actually, the French title was A Decolonial Ecology. In English, the A was moved out. But I believe that there are different places from which this political understanding of ecological issues can be suggested. From the Caribbean world, it is absolutely inconceivable to have this environmentalist perspective of ecological issues and not challenge the way these societies have been structured, founded with coloniality. And in doing so allows one to see other voices, other perspectives. And these are some of the perspectives that when I did my master's degree and then my dissertation, I was not taught about. People like Francia Marquez, who won the Goldman Environmental Prize in 2018, and she's actually running for president of Colombia. People like Wangari Maathai, who of course was made famous by the Nobel Peace Prize she got in 2004, I think. But she was the founder of the Green Belt movement in Kenya. And people like Ken Saro-Wiwa and Jean Wiener. Jean Wiener is a marine biologist of Haiti. And it allows to also not only diversify the bodies and faces that are taking place in the environmental movement, but also the perspectives. I'm sorry, this table is in French, so I will not comment on it, but let's just say that, but I'm in constant dialogue with what I call the classic genealogy of environmentalism, and suggest a more political, justice conducive one from the Caribbean. I'll leave it at that.